Good morning to all of you. Of course, it's my pleasure to open this second part of the morning session dedicated to the platform trial. We have the three speakers, three presentations, and at the end we will also have the time to discuss your questions. You can put it on chat or question answers. We can start with the first presentation, and it's my great pleasure to invite Lennie Derde. Lennie is the intensive care consultant at the University Medical Center in Utrecht with the research focus on prevention and treatment of the severe infections and sepsis in critically ill patients. And also she's the lead or European lead investigator for the platform REMAP-CAP trial. Lennie, please, your floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regina, and thank you everyone for joining. So the title of my talk was a multi-domain platform trial with adaptive randomization. If you read that title, you may be confused because, what's the multi-domain thing? What's the platform thing? What's the adaptive randomization? And how does it all fit together? So I decided to reframe my talk as the what, why, and how of adaptive platform trials, because I think it's good before we kind of dive into REMAP-CAP to spend a little bit of time on the terminology. So this is how we view adaptive platform trials. Adaptive platform trials are a randomized controlled trial, like every other RCT that you've ever read, and I think we're all very familiar with them. But there are two things that make an adaptive platform trial smart, and those are that they work under a master or core protocol, and that they have design features that make them adaptive, which make them especially suitable for doing research in pandemics. And if you have these three aspects, if it's randomized, if it works under a master protocol and is adaptive, that is what we call an adaptive platform trial. So you can have a platform trial working under a master protocol without adaptive features. You can have a trial with adaptive design features without it using a master protocol. But I would call only a trial that has all these three things an adaptive platform trial. And one of the smart things, as I said, is the adaptive aspect. And I like to kind of explain the adaptivity of the trial by showing you this slide. So this is Google Maps, and this is, I think, what sets out the adaptive design features from a traditional RCT. So in a traditional RCT, you just have the address where you want to end up, and you don't have any information that changes the course of your trial during the conduct of the trial. In an adaptive platform trial, it's different. You kind of have continuous traffic updates showing you the most efficient route to your destination. And if you want to put that in a little bit more technical terms, this is what a traditional RCT looks like. You enroll patients, you randomize them, and then you record their outcome, and then you update the trial data with their outcomes. This is what an adaptive trial looks like. Sorry for my voice. Again, you enroll patients, starting in the left top corner of the slide. The patients are randomized, you record their outcome, and you update the trial data, just as you do with a regular RCT. But here it becomes different, because in an adaptive trial or in an adaptive platform trial, you then update the statistical model and see if the data you've collected so far reach a pre-specified termination rule. And to assess that, you do frequent adaptive analyses. So that's different from a traditional interim analysis you would do in an RCT, because interim analyses come with all kinds of alpha spending and stuff like that. This works a little bit differently, so that's why we call it adaptive analyses. And if your data then show you that you've hit a pre-specified trigger, let's say you are now sure that intervention A is 99%, has a 99% posterior probability of being effective, you then draw a platform conclusion and graduate that intervention from the trial. If that doesn't happen, you can still do some adaptations to the trial. So let's say at the point of your adaptive analysis, you're not 99% sure, but let's say you're 70% sure that intervention A is the best of all your interventions. That is obviously a little bit too low to stop randomizing and to conclude the trial. But what you could do is, out of the next 100 patients, randomize 70 to the most promising intervention and 30 to the less promising intervention. And if you kind of set the boundaries for that to not be too extreme, you can be much more efficient with this type of design. Let me just say that updating these randomization weights, so performing response adaptive randomization, is not compulsory. It's just one of the adaptive features of an adaptive platform trial. So you can run an adaptive trial without doing RAR, response adaptive randomization. If I then take you through how such a trial works, this is more or less how it goes. So let's say in this trial, we're investigating 3 different active interventions against a control. You can see that that's already a little bit more efficient than a traditional trial where you would have 1 intervention arm and a control, because from the little figures above the blue box, you can see that only relatively few patients are randomized to the control arm. So what you do prior to the start of the trial is you define your thresholds for superiority, as I just showed you in the circular graph on the previous slide. So let's say our green bar is 99% sure that something works, and we also have a certain threshold for when we consider something to be inferior. So if the trial then runs and we accumulate patients into the trial, you can see that there starts to be a little difference between the active interventions and control. And what you can see is the response adaptive randomization here makes sure that less patients are randomized to the less promising intervention number 1 than to the more promising intervention number 2. But still, they are both in the trial because they haven't crossed the threshold for inferiority or superiority. And if one would float back to, towards the effect of 2, then we would again include a little bit more patients to that arm. So if we let the trial run a little bit further, this is what could happen. So here, intervention 1 crosses the threshold for inferiority, now drops out of the trial with relatively few patients assigned to that arm, and then we continue with the arms 2 and 3 and with control. What's not stated here is that you could at that point also include another arm in this trial. That's just something that's not in this graph. And then a little later on in the trial, you could find that intervention 2 is superior to 3 in control. And that means you stop the trial and have a platform conclusion. So that's how the adaptive design of adaptive platform trials could work. So what we use in REMAP-CAP to kind of facilitate that is a Bayesian statistical framework. And the reason for that is that it's just much more suited for the adaptive design features. It's not necessary. You can do an adaptive platform trial with just frequentist statistics, but we feel this is a little bit easier to work with and also gives you much more intuitive results. So I see the Bayesian framework that we use kind of as the Delta works that we have in the Netherlands. I'm from the Netherlands. So the Delta works were instigated after a large flood had caused some damage and a lot of lives were lost. But instead of kind of upping all the dikes, which would be your traditional solution, there were some smart people who said, what we could do is not close off all of these islands to prevent floods, because that would have major changes to the environment. You would have sweet water instead of salt water, and all kinds of things would change. But what we could do is we could make kind of flexible dams to stop floods if they happen, but they could be open if the floods don't happen. And then we have kind of the best of both worlds, and we're very flexible and adaptive, but we're also very robust. And they built that step by step by step. That's also how our Bayesian statistical framework works. And it took a bit of time to develop the whole model underlying the trial. So this is what the model does. So as I said before, adaptive platform trials, including REMAP-CAP, and we're now moving towards REMAP-CAP, they work under a master protocol that we happen to call the core protocol. And we actually also have a specific appendix of the protocol that describes the things, and this was done before the pandemic, describes the things that would change in a pandemic. For instance, you can imagine that in a pandemic, you would like to have a little bit shorter turnaround time for your primary endpoint. So we chose 21 organ support-free days at day 21 instead of day 90 mortality. And you would also, for instance, have to redefine what an ICU exactly is and what includes that. So before the pandemic, we had 4 what we call domains. Domains are just groups of comparable interventions. So we write a modular part of the protocol for each of these domains. And such a domain was, for instance, an antibiotic domain and a domain investigating corticosteroids for the treatment of regular CAP. And in the pandemic, we have added a strata to the trial, a pandemic strata. We have added, well, I think up to now 14 new domains, some of which are only applicable to COVID-19 patients. Some of them are applicable also to regular CAP patients. And our model now includes a non-pandemic and a pandemic part. And for the patients that are considered to be pandemic patients, we not only include the, let's say, ICU patients, but also the patients who are not on organ support, who sometimes are on a ward. They sometimes also admitted to an ICU. The organ support is what distinguishes between the moderate and the severe state in our trial. And that is what makes the trial multifactorial, which was the second smart design feature I showed you at the very beginning. So the multifactorial, and this is a little bit similar to the recovery trial that was just presented, people can be randomized to several interventions at once. And this makes the trial very, very efficient. So after assessing eligibility for the platform, and before the pandemic, that was severe CAP. For the pandemic strata, you need to be suspected or proven to have COVID-19. After assessing eligibility for the platform, the system then assesses the eligibility of each patient for each domain. So let's say we are pre-pandemic, just for ease of speaking and not making it too complicated on the slide. I've only indicated 3 domains. So this could be a site where only 3 domains are open, because sites can choose to how many domains they participate, and they can also choose which interventions they are able to bring to the trial. So if a patient is then eligible for the antibiotic domain, eligible for the steroids domain, and has influenza as cause of their CAP, which makes them eligible for the oseltamivir domain, they then get assigned 1 intervention within each domain. So this is like participating in 3 trials at the same time, except you can now also assess the interaction between the effect of antibiotics and steroids and oseltamivir. So that's one of the cool features of the trial. So the patient then eventually gets assigned a whole regimen of treatments. They get antibiotic C within that domain, they get steroid strategy A, and they get oseltamivir strategy A. So their regimen is CAA. And you can imagine that with 14 domains up and running now, there's a huge number of domains, regimens, that we are currently assessing. So if you then take this multifactorial aspect of the design and you take the adaptiveness of the platform, you know that it's randomized. And then what we've also tried to do is embed this in clinical care so that every doctor at the bedside can include a patient because, and Marion has alluded to that in her talk, it has to be a bit pragmatic because people are overwhelmed by the clinical tasks that they have to perform, and it has to be easy. So if you then take all these design aspects, that then makes up the remap of remap CAP. So the question is, why did we choose CAP? We chose CAP because if there was ever going to be a pandemic, and we set up this trial to function as answering questions for CAP and being able to pivot in a pandemic, CAP is the most logical disease to expect if there was ever going to be a pandemic. If there's going to be a pandemic and ICUs are going to be involved, it's going to be a respiratory infection, most likely a viral infection. And I think you may have seen things like this before. In the last pandemic, the influenza A or swine flu pandemic, many trials were started and protocols were submitted, but before they were approved, most of the pandemic had already passed. And there are a couple of ways to tackle that. For instance, if you start very early and you have quick turnaround times in a very pragmatic trial like recovery, you can still catch a large part of the wave as they did. But what you can also do is set up the trial before the pandemic even starts, which is a strategy that we chose and that was funded since 2014 by the European Commission. I'll skip this. So what were we able to do when the COVID pandemic hit us? We were able to extend the trial to new regions, which was, I think, quite challenging during the pandemic, but I think has really helped make this an international trial that has a good generalizability for many people treating patients. Just want to say that there are several international sponsors, so that requires a good collaboration, which we were able to do because we were already working together since the seed funding from the European Union in 2014. We are currently running 14 domains, although the last two that I have on the slide are stopped. We're working on including new domains. And as I said, we're investigating a huge number of regimens. I think it's over 17,000 at the moment because it multiplies with each domain. This is a timeline of the accomplishments of the trial. So again, I think we were quite early because we had the pandemic appendix done and we activated that pandemic strata early on the 3rd of March. And a couple of days later, the first pandemic patient was included and we published the results from the steroid domain in September 2020 and the results for tocilizumab and sarilumab end of February of this year. And we've also concluded on therapeutic anticoagulation in the severe as well as the moderate patients. Those are out as a preprint and we're hoping to have the peer-reviewed publication soon. We've also concluded on convalescent plasma as well as antivirals, and we've now concluded the whole immune modulation domain. This is a recruitment graph that I will go over quickly. And here you can see that we have currently almost 7,500 patients included, but that adds up to over 13,000 randomizations because patients are included in multiple domains. And we currently have, as I said, 14 domains with 46 different interventions that are then combined in the treatment regimens of the patients in 320 it is today, active sites across the globe. So are adaptive platform trials the answer to everything? No, especially the setup of REMAP-CAP, that took a lot of time. I think it did help us enormously to have kind of a robust fundament of the trial running before the pandemic hit us. This type of trial is very suitable to do investigations in a situation where you have a changing standard of care. This was alluded to in the last presentation as well, but in our model, we include time as a covariate, so we can model time. We can answer multiple questions at the same time, and as I said, we can learn about the interactions between the different treatments. So in brief, REMAP-CAP, as an example of an adaptive platform trial, allows us to kind of learn while we are doing. It's more than a trial. It's a way of integrating clinical care and research because we learn while we do, and then we can adapt the trial because of the flexibility of the design. So with that, I'd like to thank the huge number of REMAP-CAP investigators who've all come together to do this. And if you want to learn more about the trial, there's some social media and podcast information at the bottom of the slide where you can find us. Thank you.
Yeah, Lennie, thank you very much for your interesting and also instructive presentation. On also congratulations to your work.